third part of this series, Resolution. Most of us, focus on self-improvement because the beginning of the year is, when we make ourselves better. And we ask this question, or maybe you didn't ask it this way, but essentially the first of the year question is, what should I do about me? How do I make me better? How do I get slimmer? How do I get stronger? How do I get smarter? How do I get my family out of debt? How do I make sure that my kids are moving in the right direction? But we've said throughout this series that there is a bigger, broader question, a question that goes way beyond us. And the question is, what needs to be done around me? Not just what do I need to do for me, but what needs to be done around me? Because if you really want to become a better person, do something to make your world a better place. Whether it's your neighborhood, your community, maybe you have the potential to make the world, or a slice of the world, a better place. And the question that really has kind of gripped us emotionally, that's driven us through this series that we captured from that first message from the book of Nehemiah, was this question: what breaks your heart? If you want to know what to do with you, if you want to know what to do outside of you, if you want to do something beyond your family and your grandkids and your marriage to impact the world, then you answer this question: what breaks your heart? Because a lot of things disturb you, and a lot of things disturb me, but every once in a while, and we're praying that for all of us, every once in a while, you hear a story, or you see a trend in culture, maybe in your community, maybe in your city, maybe in our state, maybe in our country, maybe somewhere else in the world, and it kind of grips your heart. And it's more than just a news item. In fact, you've gone online to find out more about it. You read that article twice. When this subject comes up, you've sort of gotten familiar with the details of this issue in the world. And you wonder, why does this bother me? Why does this bother me? But part of your heart just goes there. And so you've discovered, or you're beginning to discover, the answer to this question: what breaks your heart? Now, the problem with this question, we said last week, this is a dangerous question, because once you answer it and once you decide to do something about it, it's going to cost you. It's going to require something of you. It's going to require some time. It's going to require some money. It's going to require some missed opportunity. It may even distract a little bit from what you're doing with your family. Because once you discover what breaks your heart, and once you step out into the great unknown, even though you're not super resourced, even though you're not super connected, even though you don't think you can really make a big difference, but you're thinking, I'm going to make a little bit of a difference, immediately you're going to feel that tension of, but this is going to cost me. This is going to distract me from the things that I've focused my life on. Because what it's going to cost you is just that. It's going to cost you some life. And as we said last week, we are all by nature, me included, what? We are life preservers. I don't want to give up my life. I don't want to give away my life. And then to the rescue, Jesus came along, as we said last week. And he taught us this. He said, whoever devotes themselves to themselves will have nothing but themselves to show for themselves. And that's disturbing, because you don't want to get to the end of your life and have maintained the perfect weight and the perfect schedule, and you never went in debt, but you never did anything for anybody else. Because at the end of your life, you will have leveraged your life for nothing but you, and Jesus says that is a total loss. But then he flipped it around and he said, but if you devote yourself to more than yourself, you will have more than yourself to show for yourself. And I think there's something in all of us, this kind of lights us up, to think that we could get to the end of our lives and people would line up and thank us for something very specific. And I cast that vision to you last week. What would you like people to line up at the end of your life and thank you for? And if you know the answer to that question, you have begun to discover what it is that really has captured or breaks your heart. So in terms of the question, in terms of wrestling with this isn't a religious thing. This is just a thing. This is just a people thing. But if you are a Christian, there is a slice of this that is very, very, very important for you and very important for me to understand. So today, here's what I want to do. I just want to pick on us Christians a little bit, all right? And if you're not a Christian, you're going to love this message, because you're going to be able to sit back and say, yep. In fact, Andy, that's exactly why I don't go to church. Yep, that's exactly why I don't like Christians. That's why I don't want to do business with Christians, and I don't want my children to marry any Christians. You've hit on it. That's exactly what the problem is. Because we as Christians, if we're not careful, and this is true of all religions, but let's just talk about us girls for a second. We as Christians, okay, we have a tendency, if we're not careful, to substitute devotion for action. To substitute devotion, the vertical, for action, the horizontal. In other words, if we're not careful, we are so content to believe and so content to believe all the right things that we think, you know what? I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe he rose from the dead. I believe the New Testament. I believe all the things I was taught to believe. So me and God are good because I believe all the right things. But then you actually open up the New Testament and ask yourself, am I really following Jesus? And suddenly you discover, as we're going to discover today, that believing is not enough. Now, this isn't a sermon or a message about how to become a Christian or how to stay a Christian. This is about what would it look like if you decided, instead of simply being categorically a Christian, you stepped out and decided to follow Jesus. Because when you decide to actually follow Jesus, personal devotion is not enough and belief is not enough. But believers are often content to believe something rather than do something. So I thought maybe we should quit calling ourselves believers and call ourselves doers. In fact, that's exactly what James said. That's exactly what Jesus taught. He said, hey, if you hear these words of mine and don't do anything with them, you're like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and when the storm came, the whole thing fell down. Unfortunately, and maybe this is just my past or the tradition I grew up in, because it is the tradition I grew up in, sometimes we are way more content with simply making a point than making a difference. And we as Christians are really good at making a point, aren't we? We are really good at shaking our fingers at the screen. We are really good at shaking our fingers at culture. We are really good at shaking our fingers about all the things that are wrong in the world. And kids don't ever, and honey don't ever. And if people would just listen to us, I don't know what's wrong with people. And we make point after point after point after point. But as we're about to discover, if all you do and if all we do is make points and don't make a difference, we are not good Christians. So today I want to take you to one of the most familiar passages in the entire New Testament. In fact, those of you who are married, chances are there were verses from this chapter of the Bible read in your wedding, not the ones we're about to look at because they're so disturbing, the ones that came right after, okay, all the lovey-dovey stuff, you know. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, written by the Apostle Paul. Paul was such an important figure in the history of Christendom. Now, one of the reasons that I take the New Testament seriously and take the Bible seriously and take, Christianity seriously is this. Look, check this out. Paul was from this area, the Holy Land. We call it the Holy Land, Jerusalem. And just a few years after the death of Jesus, just really a few years after Jesus was crucified, next thing you know, there are Jesus followers in churches all the way up here in Rome, Philippi, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, Thessalonica, all these major port cities. Suddenly, there are churches cropping up. There are people who are Jesus followers and they're not Jews. And the reason is because the Apostle Paul decided it is not enough to believe this. I got to do something with it. And he got on a ship that most of you wouldn't go more than 200 or 300 yards on, much less cross the Mediterranean Sea, visited all of these port cities, planted all of these churches, and then wrote them letters to encourage them as time went by. The Apostle Paul says some extraordinarily disturbing things. So if you're a Christian and you are not disturbed by the end of the message, I have not been clear, because these are very, very disturbing, disconcerting words. If you're not a Christian, you gotta love this, because this is the reason you resist Christianity, I guarantee you, or at least it's part of it. So in 1 Corinthians 13, he has just finished in the previous chapters talking about giftedness, and by giftedness, he's really kind of talking about personality traits or the things that God allows a person to be good at versus other things they're not so good at. And then he addresses those of us who think that God is impressed with devotion that doesn't have an emotion, okay? He addresses those of us who basically think that God is all impressed with what we know as opposed to what we do. And so he says in these verses, look, in case you have to leave early, here it is. Put some motion in your devotion. I think we should write a song about that, right? He says, look, Christians, it is not enough to believe. You've got to do something with what you know, otherwise. And what he says on the other side of the otherwise is what's so disturbing. I'll just read it to you. Here's what he says. He says, if I, and he says I, but he's really talking about you, because he's trying to sort of soft sell this because it's so offensive. So instead of saying if you, he says if I, but he's talking about you and me. If I speak in the tongues, and this Greek word really just means languages. If I speak in the languages of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, what he's talking about here, he says, look, if I had this supernatural ability to speak in multiple languages, so people from different parts of the world could understand me because I could speak in their language, and it was a supernatural gift, because he's just finished talking about giftedness. He said, let's take it a bit further because this whole passage is a bit of hyperbole. He says, let's say that I actually understood the language of angels. Not only can I speak to people from different parts of the world in their language without even studying their language, let's say that I was so good I could talk to the angels in angel language, to which we would say, Paul, do angels even have a language? To which he would say, I have no idea. Okay, this is an illustration. I'm just saying, if there was such thing as angel language, even if I had the ability to converse with the angels, that you would hear Paul talking and you would say, who are you talking to? She's talking to the angels. Now, we lock people up that do that. But listen, Paul's saying, let's just pretend that I was so, here's his point. Let's imagine that I was so connected to God, that God gave me the ability to speak multiple languages, and he even taught me, or I was even enabled to speak to angels in angel language. But if I don't have love, and this is that Greek word agape we've heard before. It's love that sort of action, not sort of, but it's that action-oriented love. It's the other-centered love. It's the doing love. It's the love where you actually do something instead of just sit on it. He says, if I had this extraordinary connection with God, but I don't do something as it relates to loving other people, I'm only a resounding gong. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Your Move. I'm Andy Stanley. One of the things that stick around, because that's what honey, don't ever into the messiness of other people to help other people. You are Uden and Uthen. You are nothing and you are worthless, and your faith has no. What if the only thing people resisted about the church was the fact that we believe Jesus was the Son of God? I'm telling you, nobody has resisted the church because the church loved too much. Nobody has resisted. Find a way to actively love the people who are in the situation that break your heart. Because as Jesus taught in unmistakable terms, it is doing If you go to the website at the bottom of your screen, you can download our free app where you can see all of our Your Move content for free forever. And the app is the